Deep water smallmouth intimidate almost every smallmouth angler. They're hard to find, often hard to reach, and even often hard to get to bite, especially when you compare it to shallow water. Let's dive into some of the finesse presentations that will get rid of that frustration and turn that day into one of the best bites you've ever had. In this video, I'm going to go through what we look for when we get out looking for deep fish. I'm going to tell you how we rig our rods and the types of presentations we have a lot of success with. So how do we locate these fish in deep water? You know, a lot of anglers get out on the lake and they're completely overwhelmed because it's a big body of water. You have nothing to really see. You can't see the bottom, and just understanding where those fish even are is sometimes hard to figure out. So when we get out there on the water, the first thing we're doing is we're envisioning what the bottom could look like. Just like up shallow, you've got points, you've got flats, you've got drop-offs. This is where reading your electronics is pretty important. Really understanding the maps, how the depths go down, and just think about the shoreline. You know, you've had a lot of success up shallow fishing a point. Look for an offshore structure like a reef, and then start to focus on those points or the drop-offs. It's no different. So that's really the simple explanation of what we look for when we go out deep. So you're probably wondering, when should I start looking for fish deep? This is one of the biggest challenges most smallmouth anglers face. You know, early in the year, pre-spawn, those fish will come up, they'll spawn shallow, they'll stick around the shallows for a little while, but eventually they'll migrate out. So understanding the timing of that can be extremely beneficial. But most importantly, if you're up shallow and you're not seeing as many fish as you were before, odds are those fish have just moved off. They're either on their way to deep water or they're already in their deep water spots that they're going to summer in. Generally speaking, the summertime is when I'm going to focus on deep water, especially later in the summer, before the fall kicks in, before those fish pull back up into the shallow water. After they've pulled up into the shallow water in the fall, they'll then winter out in deep water. So understanding that cycle of early in the spring, they're shallow, then they're going to spawn, they're going to, beef up a little bit, feed shallow after their spawn, and then they're going to start making their way out to the deep water where there's just more oxygen for them, and also where the bait fish go that follows that oxygen. So I talked about, understanding your electronics, your mapping. So what we do before every day we go out on the water looking for deep smallmouth, especially when we're doing research and trying to find new areas, is we start off on our laptop at home and we check out the maps. There's different map companies that will show you the contours, the depths. What we normally look for is areas where it's deep water and it comes up on a shoal. Maybe it goes from 40 feet up to 20, and there's like kind of an islandy type of shoal. Maybe there's a drop off one side, but there's an irregularity in it, maybe a little point or a crack in the rock that makes it, super sharp, or just anything that's kind of different than what's in the vast expanse of the water. Then what we do is we get those waypoints, we put them on our maps, and then we get out on the lake and we go check those out. So the first thing we do when we get to those areas is we confirm on our map and our satellite that our boat is near where we thought that was when we're doing our research at home. Then we put our sonar into side scan. So this is where, if you have the right electronics, and you might not, but if you do, grab your side scan, and you basically want your electronics to show both sides of the boat. This can go out about 80 to 120 feet. We like generally to be around the 80 to 100 feet out on both sides. That's where we get the best picture and we can see really what's going on down there. Most of the time, a lot of anglers get distracted by trying to find fish. We're actually looking for the structure. So if we go through an area, we're looking for the biggest boulders, the craziest cracks, the lines, the transition lines where it goes from sand to rock, anywhere we think that those fish would relate to. So generally those irregularities, those different things that are different than what else is out there, those are the things that are generally going to attract fish. Most of the time, those fish are holding so tight to that structure, you can't see them on side scan. After we've gone through the area and we've waypointed all of the cool little spots on the spot, we'll then put the boat, we'll go back around, we'll get on the trolling motor, and that's where we'll generally start to either start fishing those areas to see if those fish will show themselves, maybe get some bites, or we'll use the forward-facing sonar if you have that, and you can actually basically turn the head of your trolling motor and see all of these different pieces of structure, and you just get more detail and you'll be able to see the separation of the fish on that structure. The one thing I do need to emphasize is that these fish out deep will move a lot. So just because they're not there one day, don't get discouraged. Keep that spot in the back of your mind, and the next time you feel like they're relating to that depth or that type of structure, you'll have a new spot that you can go to and check out. There have been spots that we found offshore that we checked 3 or 4 times, never caught a fish, never saw a fish, and then one day we went back to it and it was absolutely loaded. So keep that in mind. Every deep water spot is no different than a point or a weed bed or a pile of lily pads. There are times when the fish use them and there's times when they don't. So when you finally find one of these areas, you're probably asking yourself, how do I even identify if that's a bass, if it's, a carp? We're pretty much still doing educated guessing at this point. There are times we're wrong, but we feel like with practice and time, we've gotten better and better over the years. On 2D, we're generally looking, if we go through an area on 2D sonar, we're looking for arches. They're not going to be massive. They're just going to be little arches, and you're not going to see a lot of them. Generally, bass will school up in like 1, 2, maybe 4. They're not going to be everywhere. So keep that in mind that you're not going to see a lot of arches. If you're fishing and you've got forward-facing sonar, what we look for are medium-sized blobs, not massive blobs, or not tiny little blobs that are generally clutter or balls of bait fish. And we're also looking for smallmouth behavior. A lot of times we'll get on these big lakes, especially the Great Lakes, and we might get on a spot and we're like, wow, it's loaded, it's incredible. And we fell for this early on when we first started using forward-facing sonar, where we'd feel like we'd see 100 fish stacked on top of each other, and then we'd throw our bait over them and we wouldn't get a bite. What we learned by using the camera and our experience and catching a few fish, that oftentimes those might be walleye, and they're very sluggish. They don't behave like bass. Bass, for us, when we see them, you typically throw your bait. They're extremely curious. They'll shoot right over to the bait. They'll move pretty quick. They'll get close. Hopefully they're biting your bait, but that's going to give you a good sense if it's a bass, if it kind of behaves like a bass. We're not looking for stacks on stacks of fish. If we find stacks on stacks and they are bass, they're generally small. If we're looking for the ones we're after, which are those bigger 4, 5, 6, 7 pound smallmouth, it's usually 1, 2, maybe 4 fish in a little zone. And those are the fish we're trying to fool. So let's get into fishing the deep water. You got to think about, you want to present your bait in a very natural way that they're used to seeing down there. Just like you're doing up shallow, you want your bait to behave like, the bait fish, the panfish that they're feeding on. What that means is getting your bait down in that deep water, but also making it look normal. So there's a fine balance. A lot of anglers immediately get in deep water and they think, man, I got to throw really heavy weights to get my bait down there fast because it's really deep. If you think about it, the average bass boat is about 20 feet. From one end to the other, that's really not that long. So I always like to visualize, I look at 20 feet, it seems deep, but it's actually not. Even 40 feet is only 2 bass boat lengths. You can slow down, you can actually, and this is the biggest thing, you need to slow down, think about how you're going to present that bait, and really the patience is the key. There's a lot of times where we're using heavy weights, but more often than not, we're trying to get away with the lightest bait we can to present the bait naturally. What that means is, think about a bass down on the bottom. If they saw something just shoot down faster than any minnow they've ever seen before, there's no way they're going to be interested. So we're trying to mimic a minnow that's coming down at a speed that we think a minnow would naturally come down on. Maybe they got confused, maybe they're struggling, and they're going to slowly go down to the bottom. Oftentimes, those fish will come and intercept a bait halfway up, especially smallmouth, because they think it looks so natural. Now, there are times when we do go with heavy weights. That's when we've got, wavy conditions, a lot of wind. And really the key is go with a weight that allows you to maintain bottom contact, but still present your bait the most natural. If it's super calm, use light weights. It just means you're going to have to wait longer for your bait to get to the bottom, but be patient. That's the biggest mistake anglers make, is not having the patience to let their bait get to the bottom. Yes, you're going to make half the cast you would in a normal day up shallow, but trust me, if you have the patience, you give that bait time to get to the bottom, and you fish it normally like you would even up shallow, you're going to get the bites you're looking for. So fishing out deep is a lot different than shallow. The biggest thing I notice is you have more separation from yourself to your bait than you normally would up shallow. Out deep, you have more water column to, absorb some of the shock, the movement of your baits. This is when having your gear really dialed in makes a big difference. Having a high quality blank on your rod, like we have with our Finesse CX rods, that's why they're super high modulus. They're extremely sensitive, and we have the carbon handles in there. You don't need a carbon handle, but the more the rod can give you more feedback, the more likely you are to feel those bites out deep. Now, having line that is thinner in diameter is extremely important. The reason is the thicker your line, the more bow you're going to get in your line. What that means is if you get a bite, that bow is going to absorb that bite and that shock, and you're never going to feel anything. So we opt to go with like 5-pound test, 6-pound, usually maximum 8-pound test braid, which is really thin, that allows us to get down and cut through the water a lot better. And then using a fluorocarbon leader, that's the setup we use. It allows us to detect those bites. We're able to get more of a straight line to our bait and feel those subtle bites. A lot of the times, those fish that are out in deep water, they might not be in the mood to eat. Generally, they hang out in deep water, kind of like if you're just on the couch, you're watching TV, maybe you're not going to eat. And then eventually at some point, you're going to go to the fridge and get a snack. That's what happens. Those fish will sometimes get in the mood to eat, or when they're up shallow, generally that's what they're thinking about. They're thinking about eating. So definitely having the right setup to detect those bites. Because they're subtle, generally they're kind of neutral fish. Maybe you're tricking them into biting when they weren't actually thinking about eating, is extremely important. So when you're out deep, like I mentioned, we're using really light line. Gaining the confidence in your gear is critical because you're setting the hook on generally some of the biggest fish in the lake, and you're using that light line. I talked about 5-pound test, 6-pound leader. That's where having a really good reel, really high quality reel with a really good drag and a really good rod comes into play that can absorb a lot of that shock. Generally speaking, we're not going with a lot of power rods. We're more looking for rods that are in that medium to medium light that are going to absorb a lot of the shock that we're having with those fights or those hook sets with those deep fish. So for us, deep water is something that can be extremely complicated, but we always try to simplify things as much as possible. We've kind of got a 3-pronged approach when we're getting onto a spot, we're pulling back off of it, and we're casting onto it. Generally speaking, when we're trying to fish the deep water, we're trying to hit those isolated pieces of cover I talked about, like that isolated boulder, that super unique drop off, that little tiny point on that structure. One of those things that would attract the most and the biggest fish. I like to, if we can, if the bottom allows, meaning it's not full of gunk and I can get a clean drag, I'll often go with like a bottom bait, whether it's a jig or a juvie craw like this. I'll cast it out past that little piece of structure and I'll work it back past the structure, that boulder, whatever it may be. If I find that they're not eating that, then we'll turn to a moving bait. This often will either get a fish to bite right away, or at least with our technology or forward-facing sonar, reveal themselves and we know they're there. So I'll often use like a heavy underspin. In this case, this is a sneaky underspin in a 3/8 ounce with a drop kick shad. A lot of different moving baits you could use. I mean, there's endless possibilities. Think shallow, you're using lots of different baits. This is just one example. Now, if I can't get a fish to eat off the bottom on, say, a jig or a juvie craw or a tube, and I can't get a bite on a moving bait, that's when I'll generally go to a drop shot. So I'll use either a drop minnow or a drop kick shad. I'll generally start with a cast on the structure with the drop shot. Again, open your bail, let that bait fall straight to the bottom. Don't, close your bail and make it pendulum towards you. And you want to just dead stick on that target. This is kind of your last resort. A lot of anglers will go to this as a first resort, especially if they've practiced and they found the fish are very kind of a neutral mood or an off mood. But generally that's dead stick presentation directly on that, that certain specific piece of structure you're fishing is going to get the job done. If it doesn't, you can shake your rod. And the last option we do is we'll drop swim our drop shot, whether it's our drop minnow, maybe it's a drop worm, the hellgrammite, or a drop kick shad. We'll cast past it with our drop shot and we'll pull that bait along the bottom with the drop shot, allowing us to cover pretty much the whole underwater structure. Also, this is a really big player for us when there's gunk on the bottom, maybe some moss, something that won't allow us to fish on the bottom. Really, those are the 3 main ones. Now, if you have forward-facing sonar, it gives you other options. A lot of guys now are turning to, the jig and minnow technique. This is a hover minnow. This has got a concave belly, so it's got a very very erratic and darting action, which is very different than, you know, guys who are using other minnow profiles, especially the ones that are on tour and doing really well. This is where we'll see the fish in front of us. Pretty much you have to see the fish, or you know they're there and they're gonna like reveal themselves. Cast it over them. Let this one will actually spiral down. It'll draw the fish up, and you're hoping that that fish will intercept the bait on the drop. Or if you see the fish starting to make a move towards it, you start shaking your rod or reeling straight. Those are two retrieve options to get those fish to bite. Again, a forward-facing technique. Now, if the conditions allow, especially when it's really calm, something slow falling can make all the difference. Whether it's a super light jig, like a little finesse jig that's like 1/8 ounce, 3/16 ounce with a trailer. Maybe it's a dinger, some sort of like stick worm that's going to just kind of hover down slowly, and also like a Ned bug or anything that is almost weightless and has a super slow fall. I'm talking maybe it's taking 15 or 20 seconds to get down 20 feet. That's how slow. We've kind of unlocked that technique in the last couple of years, and it's super powerful, and I highly recommend it if the conditions allow. So hopefully this information showed you that it's really not as complicated as you might have thought. A lot of the best anglers have a super simple approach. They're super successful at, and now you have the information you need to master deep water smallmouth. If you got value out of this video and you're like what you're watching, we've got a whole series of these videos in this Finesse Boot Camp we'd love for you to check out, where we go through all sorts of different finesse techniques. So like and subscribe and follow along and learn with us.